The white light didn't just blind me, it felt physical, like successive slaps against my face. 30 reporters, packed shoulder to shoulder in the marble lobby of the LJH Tower, shoved their recording devices forward like small black daggers. "Is it true you used corporate espionage to secure your director's seat?" one shouted, his breath smelling of stale coffee and malice. "Look over here. Are you dating the heir, or are you just his imported token?" Another sneered, the word imported dripping with a venom I knew all too well as a black woman in Seoul. My heel caught on the edge of the polished granite floor. My folder slid, papers scattering across the pristine white stone, immediately stamped by the mud-stained loafers of a cameraman. I was suffocating. The noise was an absolute wall. Then, the air in the lobby dropped by 10 degrees. A hand, massive, warm, and immaculately tailored at the cuff, locked around my upper arm. The grip wasn't brutal, but it was absolute. It was an anchor. With a single fluid, violent jerk, he pulled me clean out of the center of the press circle, dragging me behind his broad, structure-built shoulders. The security guard at the door stepped forward, trying to stop him, unaware of who had just descended from the penthouse elevator. "Sir, the press is authorized by the board." "Get out of my face," he said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that instantly cut through the shutter clicks. "You're rude. I own this building." Kang Dae-hyun didn't look at the press. He didn't look at the cameras. He kept his eyes locked straight ahead, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscle beneath his flawless skin worked in jagged rhythms. He dragged me into the private executive elevator, the gold doors sliding shut, cutting off the world. He didn't let go of my arm. His fingers were trembling slightly beneath his bespoke suit sleeve. "You're late," he whispered, staring at the digital floor indicator rising toward the 45th floor. I looked at my bruised wrist, then up at his cold, unreachable profile. "And you're a liar. You told me the contract protected me from them." He finally turned his eyes down to mine. Dark. Stormy. Terrified. The contract changed the moment they found out what happened 4 months ago. But this story doesn't start in a shattered lobby under the glare of paparazzi flashlights. It doesn't start with a billionaire CEO risking a multi-billion-dollar merger to drag his corporate strategy director out of a wolf pack. It starts 4 months earlier, in a rain-slicked alleyway behind a traditional tea house in Insadong, where I learned that the most dangerous weapon a man like Kang Dae-hyun possesses isn't his money. It's his silence. My name is Zuri Vance. I am 31, a graduate of Wharton, and for 8 years, I have dismantled corporate inefficiencies across New York and London. I don't believe in fairy tales, I don't believe in luck, and I certainly didn't move to South Korea to find a savior. I moved here because LJH Holdings was the largest investment conglomerate in East Asia, and they had a bleeding wound in their international expansion division. I was hired to fix the bleed. I wasn't hired to become the variable that brought the entire structure down. The first day I walked into LJH Holdings, the atmosphere was thick with corporate hierarchy. In Seoul, seniority is oxygen. As a foreigner, and specifically as a black woman with dark skin and natural coils, I was an anomaly they didn't know how to categorize. They expected me to be loud. I was quiet. They expected me to be confused by their internal politics. I had memorized their ancestral lineage and board alliances before my flight landed at Incheon. But nothing prepares you for Kang Dae-hyun. He was 34, the youngest grandson of the legendary Chairman Kang, and a man who existed entirely in the margins of what he chose not to say. He didn't give long speeches. He didn't scream at subordinates. He simply looked at a report, set his silver fountain pen down with a small, metallic click, and the person who wrote the report would resign by nightfall. Our first meeting wasn't in a boardroom. It was at 9 p.m. on a Tuesday, 6 weeks into my contract, when the rest of the floor had gone home to drink traditional alcohol with their supervisors. I was staring at an Excel spreadsheet that didn't make sense. An acquisition project called Project Goryo was listed as a multi-million-dollar asset, but the underlying numbers were hollowed out, like an apple eaten from the inside by wasps. The inventory valuation is inflated by 14%, a voice said from the darkness of the corridor. I didn't startle. I had heard the soft, deliberate brush of handmade leather shoes on the carpet minutes before. I looked up. Dae-hyun stood in the doorway, his tie loosened by exactly 2 inches, his gray suit jacket slung over his forearm. 14.2, actually, I replied, turning my screen slightly toward him. If you factor in the depreciating logistics hub in Busan. He walked in, his presence immediately filling the small office. He didn't ask for permission. He stood behind my chair, leaning down slightly to look at the monitor. I could smell him, cedarwood, high-end green tea, and the distinct, cold ozone smell of the Seoul rain outside. You weren't assigned to project Goryeo, Director Vance, he murmured, his eyes reflecting the blue light of the spreadsheet. No. I was assigned to fix your international portfolio. And this portfolio is being anchored by a ghost ship. I turned my head to look at him. Our faces were less than 5 inches apart. I could see the tiny, faint scar near his left cheekbone, a human flaw on an otherwise manufactured statue. He didn't pull back. His eyes dropped to my mouth for a fraction of a second, then snapped back to the data. Forget you saw this. I don't forget numbers, Vice Chairman. Then learn to pretend you did, he said, his voice dropping into that dark psychology register that made your spine stiffen. Because the last person who analyzed those specific numbers is currently sitting in a detention cell in Suwon. He turned and left before I could ask another question, leaving the office cold. That was the first micro-crack in his wall. He thought he was warning me away. He didn't realize that to a woman who built her life on resolving chaos, a warning is just an invitation. By the 3rd week of my 2nd month, I realized Kang Dae-hyun's coldness wasn't indifference, it was active calculation. He was running a departmental restructuring that looked, from the outside, like an aggressive modernizing effort. In reality, he was clearing the board of his uncle's loyalists. The corporate landscape in South Korea is a battlefield disguised as a garden. Everyone smiles. Everyone bows at the correct angle, 45 degrees for the executive vice president, 15 for a peer, but underneath the linen and silk, the knives are long. I became his scalpel. Because I was an outsider, I didn't belong to any faction. I didn't go to university with his cousins. I didn't attend the same elite high school in Gangnam as the head of legal. If I fired someone, it wasn't seen as a political assassination by the Kang family, it was just the American director enforcing Western efficiency. He used me. And I used him for the massive capital leverage my portfolio received. It was a perfect, cold, clinical relationship. Until the night at the Insadong Tea House. We were meeting with a major logistics partner from Singapore. The dinner had gone poorly, the partner was old school, uncomfortable dealing with a woman who didn't lower her eyes when speaking about interest rates. Dae-hyun had remained silent throughout the meal, letting me take the brunt of the partner's passive-aggressive remarks about Western aggressiveness. After the dinner, as the cars were being brought around through the narrow, rain-slicked alleys, the Singaporean executive leaned in too close to me under the wooden eaves of the tea house. He was slightly drunk on traditional rice wine. Director Vance, he whispered, his hand coming down onto the small of my back, his fingers pressing through the silk of my dress with a greasy, familiar pressure. You know, if you want this deal to pass the regional board, you and I could discuss the terms, more privately. At my hotel in the morning. I froze. It is the universal freezing of a woman evaluating options in a public space. If I slap his hand away, I lose LJH Holdings a $40 million trade route. If I stay still, I lose my dignity. Before my brain could finalize the calculation, a hand descended from the shadows behind us. It was Dae-hyun. He didn't strike the man. He didn't shout. He simply took the Singaporean executive's wrist between his thumb and forefinger, pressing down on a specific nerve cluster near the bone. The man's face went instantly pale, his hand dropping from my back like a dead weight. Mr. Tan, Dae-hyun said, his voice terrifyingly polite, almost conversational. Your car is here. And my driver has been instructed to take you directly to the airport. Not your hotel. Vice Chairman Kang, the man stammered, nursing his wrist, his eyes wide with sudden sobriety. The contract isn't signed. The contract is dead, Dae-hyun said, stepping into the light of the paper lantern hanging from the roof. His eyes were entirely black, the pupils dilated with an intensity that made the older executive take 2 steps back into the rain. And if I see your logistics firm within the Han River district again, I will personally audit your maritime customs declarations for the last 5 years. The man scrambled into his sedan, the door slamming shut before the vehicle sped away into the dark. The alley became utterly silent, save for the steady drip of water from the clay tiles above. I stood there, my breath catching in my throat, my skin still tingling where the executive had touched me. Dae-hyun turned to me. The rage on his face didn't fade, it transformed into something else, something raw, heavy, and completely unmanaged. He stepped toward me, closing the distance until my back pressed against the old wooden pillar of the tea house. "Why didn't you move?" he demanded, his breath hot against my forehead. "It was a $40 million deal, Dae-hyun," I whispered, using his given name for the first time without thinking. "I was doing my job." "Your job is to protect my capital," he growled, his hand rising to hover just an inch away from my jawline. His fingers curled as if he wanted to touch me, but was fighting his own muscle fibers to prevent it. "Not to let third-rate merchants treat you like property. Do you understand me, Zuri? You are under my deployment. That means your safety is my asset." "An asset?" I let out a dry, short laugh. "Is that all this is?" He went entirely still. The mask came slamming back down over his features so fast it was almost audible. He pulled his hand back, tucking it into his pocket. "The car is here," he said flatly, his voice returning to its distant corporate frequency. "Go home, Director Vance. Tomorrow we review the audit papers for Project Goryo." He walked away, leaving me in the rain. But as I watched his car disappear around the corner, I realized something dangerous. Kang Dae-hyun wasn't angry because the deal was compromised. He was angry because another man had touched me. And in his world, a man who cannot control his reactions is a man who is about to lose everything. The next morning, an unmarked envelope was sitting on my desk. Inside was a single printed sheet of paper showing a corporate registry in the Cayman Islands. Project Goryo wasn't owned by LJH Holdings' uncle. It was registered under a shell corporation whose majority shareholder was a name that made my blood turn to ice: Kang Dae-hyun. The very man who told me to ignore the numbers was the one who owned the ghost ship. Was he using me to clear out his enemies, or was he setting me up to take the fall for a massive financial crime? I looked up at the glass palace of his office across the courtyard, and for the first time, the psychological weight of this building felt like a trap. I spent the next 48 hours re-verifying every string of data. If Dae-hyun was skimming from his own company, the patterns would show it. But the deeper I dug, the more contradictory the evidence became. The capital leaving Project Goryo wasn't going into a private Swiss account. It was being used to buy out the voting shares of LJH's most conservative board members, the old guard who wanted to block our international expansion. He wasn't stealing. He was staging a coup from within his own bloodline. On Friday, my office door opened without a knock. It was Jia, Dae-hyun's personal secretary, and a woman whose loyalty to him was legendary. She didn't say a word, she just gestured for me to follow her. We went down to the basement level, not the public parking lot, but the private level 3, where only the family's armored limousines were kept. The air down there smelled of cold concrete and expensive tires. Dae-hyun was waiting inside the back of a black Genesis G90. The windows were completely blacked out, creating an isolated room within the mechanical belly of the tower. "Get in," he said as the door opened. I stepped into the leather-scented interior. The door clicked shut, instantly killing the ambient noise of the building. The car didn't move. We were just sitting there, two people in an expensive box under 50 feet of reinforced concrete. "You found the Cayman registry," he stated, not looking at me. He was adjusting the silver cufflink on his left wrist, a repetitive, mechanical movement I had come to recognize as his only nervous tick. "I did," I said, keeping my voice level. "You're buying your own board's loyalty with hollowed-out assets. If the Financial Supervisory Service catches this, it's not a detention cell in Suwon you'll be looking at. It's 10 years in Yeongdeungpo. They won't catch it," he said softly, "because you're going to clean the transaction trail." I let out a sharp, cold breath. "Excuse me? I am a director of strategy, not a laundry service for corporate treason. I don't break the law for my employers." Dae-hyun finally turned his head. In the dim light of the cabin, His eyes looked sunken, carrying the weight of a man who hadn't slept in 3 days. He leaned across the leather consoles separating us. The proximity was suffocating. I could see the pulse beating rapidly in his throat. "It isn't treason if it's my survival, Zuri," he whispered, his tone dropping into a raw, desperate register that completely dismantled his usual aristocratic veneer. "My uncle isn't just trying to block the merger. He has spent the last 6 months gathering evidence on my grandfather's mental health. If he presents it to the court before the merger closes, the entire conglomerate goes into state receivership. Everything my family built, everything I have sacrificed my life to protect, will be broken down and sold to foreign private equity firms." "And what does that have to do with me?" I demanded, my chest rising and falling rapidly. "Why throw me into this fire?" "Because you're the only one who doesn't look at me with calculation," he said, his voice cracking slightly before he regained control. His hand moved toward mine, stopping just a fraction of an inch away from my fingers on the leather seat. "Everyone in this city wants something from me. My cousins want my seat. My grandfather wants my obedience. The board wants my blood. You just want the truth of the numbers. I need one person I can trust in the dark, Zuri." The word trust coming from a man like him felt heavy, almost violent. It wasn't a romantic declaration, it was a psychological surrender. He was putting his neck in my hands, showing me exactly where the skin was thinnest. I looked down at his hand, then up at his dark, unblinking gaze. The silence inside the car was immense, filled only by the sound of our synchronized breathing. "If I do this," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "I want full access to the primary ledger. No more secrets, Dae-hyun. No more warnings in alleyways." A small, genuine shift occurred in his features, the ghost of a relieved smile that transformed his cold face into something breathtakingly handsome. "Agreed. We are 15 minutes into Zuri and Dae-hyun's dangerous game, and the boundaries between corporate survival and personal obsession are completely melting away. He just confessed his deepest vulnerability to her in the dark of that limousine. But let me ask you right now, drop a comment below. Do you think Zuri should trust him and clean those ledger numbers, or is she walking directly into a trap designed to make her his corporate scapegoat? Click that subscribe button right now if you want to see exactly how she plays this billionaire at his own psychological game. Don't miss the next twist. Let's find out what happens when the old guard strikes back. The next 3 weeks were a blur of high-intensity financial restructuring. I moved my workspace from my standard office to a secure room adjacent to Dae-hyun's penthouse suite on the top floor of the tower. We worked through the night, survived on black coffee, cold noodles, and the strange, electric tension that existed between us whenever our hands crossed over the printed ledgers. He was a perfectionist, but so was I. We clashed constantly. He wanted to hide a transaction behind a maritime insurance front. I told him it was amateurish and rewrote the equity flow through an Irish technology holding. "You're too aggressive," he muttered one night at 3 a.m., staring at my corrected sheet. "You're too cautious," I replied, leaning back against the mahogany desk, stretching my tired neck. "In New York, we don't hide from the regulator. We build a maze so legal they get a headache trying to read the map." He stood up from his leather chair, walking over to where I sat. He didn't have his jacket on. His white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing forearms that were lean and roped with muscle. He stood over me, looking down with an expression that had completely lost its corporate distance. "You don't look like anyone who has ever worked in this building," he murmured, his voice low and hypnotic in the quiet of the penthouse. "Is that a compliment, Vice Chairman?" "It's an observation," he said, his fingers reaching out, finally breaking his own rule. He touched the tip of one of my natural curls, twisting it gently between his fingers. The contact sent an electric jolt straight down my spine. "The women in my circle are like porcelain. Beautiful, static, terrified of breaking. You look like you could survive a fire and come out holding the match." "I've had to," I said, my voice dropping as he leaned closer. "When you look like me in a world that looks like this, you don't get the luxury of being porcelain. You either become steel or you get crushed into dust." His eyes widened slightly, a deep, primal recognition flashing within them. He leaned down, his forehead almost touching mine. Then let me be the one who holds the shield, Zuri. Just for once. The moment was interrupted by the sharp, rhythmic vibration of his personal phone on the desk. The caller ID showed Chairman Kang. The illusion shattered. Dae-hyun straightened up instantly, the cold aristocrat returning in a fraction of a second. He picked up the phone, listened for 10 seconds, his face turning an ash-gray color. "I understand," he said tightly, then hung up. He turned to me, his hands fists at his sides. "My uncle just called an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. He filed an injunction to suspend my voting rights, citing irregular asset management in Project Goryeo. Someone leaked the Cayman registry papers." My heart dropped. Who had access besides us? "Nobody," Dae-hyun whispered, his eyes fixing on mine with a sudden, agonizing flash of suspicion. "Nobody but you, Zuri." The atmosphere in the grand boardroom on the 45th floor was identical to a high court trial. 22 elderly Korean men, dressed in identical dark navy suits, sat around an oval table that could have hosted a UN summit. At the head sat Chairman Kang, an ancient man with white hair and eyes like frozen obsidian, leaning heavily on a gold-headed cane. Dae-hyun sat to his right, his expression a mask of absolute marble. I stood at the back of the room near the translation booth, my fingers tight around my tablet. Director Kang Moon-soo, Dae-hyun's uncle, stood up with a triumphant smile. He slammed a thick leather-bound folder onto the center of the table. "For months, this board has been pressured by the vice chairman to approve this international merger," Moon-soo announced, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "We were told it was for the future of LJH. But now we see the truth. Dae-hyun has been using a shell company in the Caymans, Project Goryeo, to systematically drain assets from our domestic logistics branches to fund his private stock acquisitions." A low murmur broke out among the board members. Several of them looked at Dae-hyun with open disgust. "And who executed these transactions?" Moon-soo pointed a finger directly toward the back of the room, directly at me. "The foreign director he hired outside our standard human resource protocol. Zuri Vance. A woman with no loyalty to this family, brought here specifically to act as his financial mercenary." Every eye in the room turned to me. The weight of their collective judgment was immense, a suffocating mixture of xenophobia, corporate arrogance, and political malice. Dae-hyun, the old chairman, spoke, his voice cracking with age, but carrying an absolute authority that silenced the room instantly. "Is this true? Did you authorize these transactions behind your grandfather's back?" Dae-hyun didn't flinch. He stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with a slow, deliberate movement that oozed unbothered arrogance. "The documentation presented by Director Moon-soo is indeed authentic," Dae-hyun said smoothly. My breath stopped in my lungs. He was throwing me to the wolves. He was going to use the exact defense I feared, blaming the foreign director. However, Dae-hyun continued, his voice rising in volume, cutting through the sudden gasps of the board. "My uncle has misread the recipient ledger. The Cayman entity isn't my private fund. If you open page 42 of the Verified Audit Framework, which was submitted to the Financial Supervisory Service 3 hours ago by Director Vance, you will see that the majority shareholder of that entity is actually the LJH Employee Pension Fund." The room went completely chaotic. Moon-soo froze, his hand still extended toward me, his fingers trembling. "I didn't drain assets for myself, Uncle," Dae-hyun said, a cold, predatory smile appearing on his lips. "I transferred depreciating assets into a high-yield international trust to secure the retirement payouts for 50,000 of our factory workers, a trust that my uncle's division had underfunded by 12% over the last decade. Director Vance didn't assist a crime. She corrected a corporate deficit that would have ruined this family's reputation if it went public." Chairman Kang closed his eyes, then struck his cane against the floor once. Thud. "Moon-soo," the chairman said softly. "You are dismissed from your chair. HR will process your retirement package by noon." Moon-soo collapsed back into his seat, his face completely drained of color. I stood at the back of the room, my hands shaking slightly from the sheer adrenaline release. Dae-hyun looked across the long mahogany table, his eyes locking onto mine. It was a victory. Clean, brutal, and perfectly executed. But as I looked at the defeated faces of Moonsu's faction, I realized something dark. A cornered animal doesn't go quietly. They didn't have the power to destroy Dae-hyun within the building anymore. So, they were going to take the war to the one place where logic doesn't matter, the public street. The retaliation happened exactly 2 hours later. I was leaving the tower to head to a lunch meeting with our legal counsel when the elevator doors opened into the ground floor lobby. The world went white. Moonsu had leaked a completely fabricated story to 3 major tabloid outlets. Foreign director uses espionage and seduction to control LJH Air. They didn't care about the pension fund ledger. They cared about the scandal. They cared about the image of a tall, beautiful black woman standing next to the city's most eligible billionaire bachelor in a traditional culture that still viewed mixed relationships with deep suspicion. Director Vance, did you alter the records to protect the vice chairman? Are you his mistress? Look over here. Is it true you're being deported? The press corps was an absolute wall of meat and lenses. I couldn't move forward, I couldn't move back. A cameraman rammed his heavy equipment into my shoulder, sending my files flying across the stone floor. The security guards, overwhelmed or perhaps instructed by Moonsu's remaining loyalists, stayed back. I was entirely alone in the glare. My chest tightened. The psychological armor I had worn for 8 years in corporate finance was beginning to liquefy under the sheer, unadulterated hatred of the crowd. Then, the hand locked around my arm. Dae-hyun pulled me clean out of the press circle, his broad shoulders cutting through the flashes like an iron prow through water. Get out of my face, he told the guard who tried to explain the board's press authorization. You're rude. I own this building. We plummeted up into the private executive elevator, the gold doors shutting out the screaming voices of the reporters. The silence inside the cabin was deafening, save for the heavy, ragged sound of our breathing. He didn't let go of my arm. His grip was so tight I could feel his pulse beating against my skin. You're late, he whispered, his eyes fixed on the rising floor indicator. And you're a liar, I said, my voice shaking with a mixture of rage and leftover terror. You told me the strategy framework would protect me. Look at what they're doing out there. My career is done, Dae-hyun. My name is being dragged through every gutter in Seoul. The elevator stopped at the penthouse level. He dragged me out into his private residence, a massive, minimalist space of dark wood, glass, and panoramic views of the city. He finally released my arm, turning to face me. His suit jacket was crumpled, his hair, usually styled to perfection, was messy from the lobby scuffle. It isn't done, he said, his voice deep and shaking with an emotion I had never heard in him before. I won't let them touch you, Zuri. You can't stop them. I screamed, the tears finally breaking through my defenses. This isn't a boardroom, Dae-hyun. You can't fire 30 journalists. You can't rewrite the public opinion with a pension fund ledger. They look at me and they see an outsider who doesn't belong in your world, and they will use that to destroy everything we worked for. He stepped forward, his hands coming up to lock around my face, his fingers burying themselves deep into my hair. The contact was sudden, hard, and completely uncalculated. He forced me to look up into his eyes. They were wide, terrified, and burning with an intensity that completely paralyzed me. Then I will change the world, he whispered against my lips. Because I don't give a damn about the merger anymore, Zuri. I don't care about LJH Holdings. I care about you. Before I could process the words, his mouth came down onto mine. It wasn't a corporate negotiation. It wasn't a careful, slow-burn contract arrangement. It was a desperate, chaotic collision of 2 people who had spent months pretending they were made of stone while burning alive from the inside. He kissed me with a hunger that felt like survival, his tongue tracing my lips, his hands pulling my body flush against his chest until I couldn't tell where my breath ended and his began. I wrapped my arms around his neck, my fingers locking into his hair, throwing away every rule, every line of contract prose, and every bit of logic I had built my life upon. In the middle of a corporate war, in a city that wanted to reject us, we were choosing our own destruction. And it felt like the only real thing I had ever touched. When he finally pulled back, his forehead rested against mine, his breath coming in shallow, hot gasps. His hands stayed on my cheeks, his thumbs gently wiping away the tear tracks. "We can't hide this," I whispered, looking at the city lights beginning to flicker outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. "If the board sees us like this, they will use it to strip your remaining executive authority." "Let them try," he said, his voice regaining that terrifying, steady tone of an absolute ruler. He walked over to his desk, picking up his personal silver fountain pen. He didn't look at a ledger, he looked at me. "The merger closes in 48 hours. My uncle thinks he used the press to isolate me. He doesn't realize he just gave me the one variable I needed to break the family's control over my life entirely. What are you going to do?" He slid a clean sheet of LJH letterhead across the desk. "We're going to write a new agreement, Director Vance. But this one doesn't have an expiration date. And it doesn't have a clause for public distance." As I walked to the window, looking down at the tiny, distant ant-like shapes of the reporters still waiting outside the main gates of the tower, I knew the war was far from over. Moon-soo was already meeting with the minority shareholders at a hotel in Gangnam. The public was digesting the scandalous headlines by the second. But as I felt Dae-hyun's arms come around my waist from behind, his chin resting against my shoulder as we stared down at the wolves together, I realized that the algorithm of our relationship had permanently shifted. They thought they were exposing a scandal. They didn't realize they had just forced a predator to take off his leash. The next 48 hours were the most expensive real estate of my life. Dae-hyun didn't issue a standard corporate denial. He didn't send his communications director to lie to the cameras. Instead, he bought the primetime commercial slot on 3 national television networks during the Sunday evening news broadcast. He didn't present a presentation. He sat in a simple black chair against a gray background, dressed in a plain black suit without a tie, looking directly into the lens of the main camera. "For 30 years, LJH Holdings has told the public that we represent the traditional values of our nation," Dae-hyun said, his voice level, calm, and broadcast into millions of homes across the peninsula. "But true value isn't found in looking backward. It's found in recognizing excellence when it arrives." Director Zuri Vance didn't infiltrate this company. She saved it from the internal greed of men who cared more about their private lineage than the livelihoods of our employees. He held up a signed copy of the final international merger document, stamped and sealed by the Singaporean Regional Board, who had crawled back to the table after I rerouted the logistics matrix through our new secure framework. "The merger is closed," Dae-hyun announced, a small, cold, victorious smile appearing on his lips. "And as of this morning, I have transferred my personal equity stake into a joint partnership structure with Director Vance. She isn't an imported asset. She is the future of this enterprise. And anyone who wishes to challenge her position will have to purchase the building from me first." The broadcast cut to black. Inside the penthouse, the silence returned, clean and absolute. The phone on the table was vibrating continuously, Chairman Kang, the legal department, the public relations firm, but Dae-hyun didn't look at it. He walked into the kitchen, where a fresh pot of imported ginger tea was steeping on the stove, its warm, spicy aroma filling the air. He poured 2 cups, bringing one over to where I sat on the sofa. He sat down next to me, our knees touching, the distance between us completely gone. "Was it aggressive enough for you?" he asked softly, handing me the mug. I took a sip, the warmth spreading through my chest, clearing away the last remnants of the boardroom smoke. I looked at his unmasked, exhausted, but entirely free face. "It was a bit dramatic," I smiled, leaning my head against his shoulder. But the logic was flawless. He wrapped his arm around me, his fingers locking into my coils, pulling me close against his side as the city lights of Seoul stretched out below us, no longer a battlefield, but a kingdom we had dismantled and rebuilt on our own terms. If this story hit you right in the chest, if you felt the absolute weight of Dae-hyun pulling Zuri away from those cameras and showing the world what happens when a billionaire stops playing by the rules, then you already know why this channel exists. We don't just write simple drama. We write about the moments when the structures we build to keep ourselves safe become the very things that prevent us from taking what we actually want. Dae-hyun had an entire empire built on absolute control, and he threw it into the river the second another man threatened the woman he loved. Don't let your own story stay behind glass. Hit that like button right now, share this video with someone who stays up far too late chasing narratives that make them feel alive, and most importantly, subscribe to Soul and Soul Stories right now. We have 20 more upgraded, high-stakes psychological corporate romance dramas coming down the pipeline this season, and trust me, you don't want to be the one left outside the boardroom when the doors close. Thank you for watching. Leave your final thoughts in the comments below. Did Dae-hyun handle his uncle correctly, or is the old guard going to find another way to strike back? Let's discuss it in the community tab. See you in the next story.